13. Wow, what a chapter. We have just moved out of Mark chapter 12, where Jesus has basically been challenged politically, theologically, and then even really dismantled the place of the Pharisees, elders, scribes of the Jewish religion, discounted their place in the ongoing narrative of God, and also made some comments around the temple no longer being the central narrative and the loyalty of the Jews no longer being to an institution. This week in Mark 13, Jesus just pulls out all the stops. The type of literature that you're about to hear from Mark 13 is what Bible scholars call apocalyptic. Now, there are certain interpretive rules that you need to keep in mind whenever you're reading apocalyptic literature. First of all, don't take it literally. Apocalyptic literature is a type of narrative imagery that uses exaggeration, contrast. It's something that is meant to imply that something significant is being addressed. But always, and this is the thing, no matter where you go with apocalyptic literature, there are primarily three places. Daniel is one. Of course, you're guessing the other one right now, right? Revelation, of course. But also in the Gospels, from time to time, you're going to see that the Gospel writers put in this type of language called apocalyptic. And much of it quotes Old Testament imagery. You know, the moon will turn to blood, and the sky will dissolve, and the earth will melt, and you know, all this type of language. So you've got to understand, you cannot take this literally. People have made the mistake in looking at this passage thinking it was written for them. And so what they do is they dive into this and they look for a special code, and they look for dates and times and people, and well, that must be Russia, and well, this must be the Catholic Church, or this must be whatever, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, you've missed entirely the point of apocalyptic literature if you take that approach. The disciples and the Jews at this point would have understood the apocalyptic narrative. It was very, very common in the intertestamental period. In other words, the time between really 100 or 200 BC till 100, 150 AD after the death of Christ. This narrative, this type of literature was very, very common. And what we do is we make the mistake of bringing a modern mindset to a very ancient type of literature. So Jesus enters into this apocalyptic narrative mode and tells them something. The contrast between the end of chapter 13, which moves from apocalyptic mode back into more of a narrative, is in verse 1 in chapter 14. It says, Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread was only 2 days away. And so Mark flips back into a very familiar form of storytelling and writing that if you've been following the story in the first few chapters of Mark, you will go, oh, we're back to that. So chapter 13 ought to stick out to you like a sore thumb when you read it, because you're going like, whoa, what is that? It starts off, the pump is primed by the disciples really setting Jesus up, giving him what we call a softball question, giving him something to whack out of the park. As Jesus was leaving the temple, verse 1 of chapter 13, one of his disciples said to him, Look, teacher, or rabbi, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Now, Mark is setting this up here specifically because remember what has just happened. The temple will be removed from the central narrative. So now they're asking about the physicality of the temple. The foundation stones are huge. I mean, go to Google, check it out, look at an image of the temple, and you'll see that how possibly could anybody think that anybody could ever come and dismantle what had been put together, especially as Herod had been rebuilding and adding to the temple. Jesus said in verse 2, Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. At this point you hear mic drop, jaws drop, because of the massive size of these stones. Jesus then privileges the disciples, because you'll see this pattern happen a lot. The disciples are completely confused. They have no idea what he's talking about. And so he takes them aside privately and they say, What are you talking about? We have no idea what you're talking about. Jesus in verse 5 says, Watch out that no one deceives you. And then goes to use this apocalyptic language to talk about, look, things are going to get rough. There'll be wars, rumors of wars. When people come and they're claiming that I am He, don't let that faze you. When you hear of these things, disturbing things happening in the world, don't let that faze you. When people come and persecute you for the sake of the gospel, don't let that faze you. When you see in verse 14 the abomination that causes desolation, standing where it does not belong, and then Mark has this beautiful little insert there. It says, let the reader understand, like nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We all know what that means. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So this is a time of religious sacrilege. It's a time of geographic dispersal. It's a time of persecution. It's a time of false messiahs. It's a time of earth-sized news. And Jesus says, don't let it faze you. Don't let it faze you. Continue to be faithful with what you know. So this threat of the apocalyptic is always meant, in a very pastoral sense, to encourage the people in the midst of a time of persecution to be faithful with what they know. And again, if you look at the parables that surround chapter 13 here, you're going to see that it really is all about faithfulness through persecution, through unknown, and through difficulty. In other words, stay true to the gospel, even if everything around you feels like it's moving. Verse 20, if the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, whom He has chosen, He has shortened them. In other words, those of you who find yourself in this position, you need to be encouraged. God has chosen you. You are part of His special people. And this gives them a sense of identity. Remember, this was written to the early church probably 30, 40 years after the time of Christ. Scholars aren't quite sure whether this was written actually after the fall of Rome. When Rome came in the fall of Jerusalem, or it happened beforehand. There was something beforehand where Caligula actually came in because the Jews had torn down around 45 or 50 AD. The Jews had torn down one of the giant statues of the Caesar that had been pulled down because the Jews were like, you shall have no image. You shall not have a golden image or a graven image, one of the 10 commandments. So they tore it down. So Caligula, he was like, well, I'll show you. He moves in 2 legions of Roman soldiers into Jerusalem and sets up something right in the Holy of Holies in the sanctuary and says, take that. And there was nothing they could do about it. Anyway, widespread revolt, unbelievable time of unsettling for all people involved. Life felt very unsteady. And this small little Christian community finds himself in the midst of this time of massive cultural change and says, what do we do? I mean, it feels like the earth is moving under our feet. And Jesus uses this language to describe it. Verse 24, in those days following the distress, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky. Stars mean a lot of things in ancient literature, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. The heavenly bodies, again, the Romans had some mythological beliefs around that as well. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. He will send His angels, and He will gather the elect from the 4 winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heaven. In other words, in the end, tiny little church, in the midst of these cosmic events, understand God has got you. Continue to be faithful. Verse 28, now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that the summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. And this is what theologians for a long time have called the imminence of the second coming, the imminence of the victory of God. In other words, you are meant to live like the victory of God is imminent, especially when you find yourself in a traumatic and destabilizing situation. This is the point of apocalyptic literature. At its heart, it's pastoral. And its pastoral message is always, God has you. I know life is hard, but pursue the right things. Live a holy life. Trust in what you know. Be the people of God. So if you dive into this chapter looking for dates, times, people, personalities, you're going down a rabbit hole. I just advise you to stop. You'll be one of these people that writes a book that's 88 reasons why Christ is coming back in 88. Oops. 89 reasons why Christ is coming back in 89. Oops. You'll be one of those people. So what I suggest is we take the counsel of this apocalyptic chapter that Mark includes, from the words in the mouth of Jesus that's about when life gets rough, when things become unsteady, when you become confused as to what is the right thing, understand God has got you. You are his people. Be faithful to what you know. Preach the gospel. All right, God bless you. We'll see you next week.